Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we, take a whole stack of research and notes, pull out the key stuff.
And basically give you the important bits fast.
Exactly. It's like your shortcut to getting up to speed on complicated topics, maybe find a few surprises too, without feeling buried in information.
hmm
Today, we're tackling a big one, unemployment crises, and we'll be focusing quite a bit on the Great Depression.
And for this, we're using some, well, pretty fascinating sources. We've got academic work that's compiled historical U.S. labor market data, unemployment, job vacancies,
Yeah.
productivity stretching way back to 1890.
Right, 1890.
Yeah, really long-term stuff. And the sources point out that some of this older data, it hasn't actually been used all that much before.
Interesting. And to help us figure out what all this history means, especially the crazy unemployment during the Depression.
We're looking at an economic model. It's called an equilibrium search model.
Right. So our mission today, understand the long-run picture of the U.S. job market, see how this model helps explain those really tough years, the Depression years. And honestly, looking at it this way turns up some things about these crises that might make you rethink things.
Definitely. Okay, so where should we start? The data itself.
Yeah, let's unpack that historical data first. 1890 to 2017, you said.
That's the span, yeah. Monthly data.
Yeah.
And the researchers really zeroed in on the period before World War II.
Why that period specifically?
Well, it's crucial for understanding just how bad these unemployment crises could get, historically speaking.
And I bet the contrast with later years is pretty stark.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Take civilian unemployment rates. Between 1931 and 39, the average was, get this, 14.8%.
14.8 average. Whoa.
And it peaked in July 1932 at 25.5%.
A quarter of the workforce. Unbelievable. How does that compare to, say, after the war?
Well, if you look at 1951 to 2017, the average unemployment rate was just 5.8%.
Huge drop.
And the highest it ever got in that whole post-war period was under 11%.
Okay, so the Depression was just on another level entirely. What about, like, private non-farm jobs? Same picture.
Pretty much the same story, maybe even more dramatic. The average was 21.2% during the 31-39 period, peaking at 35.5%.
35%.
Yeah. Compare that to the post-war average of 7.6% and a peak below 13%.
Wow. Okay, that difference alone is...
Yeah, it's definitely an aha
Push.
moment, like you said.
But
Just
you
hammers home
don't-
the scale of it.
Exactly. And it's not just the level, it's also how often these crises happened, how long they stuck around, and just how severe they were.
So how do they define a crisis here?
They define it as unemployment going above 15%.
Okay.
And their analysis of the whole 1890-2017 period suggests the chance of being in a crisis state at any given time was around 2.93%.
Okay. Relatively small chance overall.
But, and this is a big but, once you fell into a crisis, the chances of staying there were incredibly high.
Really? How high? The persistence is estimated at about 91.11%.
Wow, 91%. So once things got really bad, they tended to stay really bad for a long time.
Precisely. It suggests getting out of those deep slumps was incredibly difficult.
Makes sense. What else did the historical data show? Anything about, like, volatility? Things swing in wildly.
Yeah, definitely. The pre-war labor market was much, much more volatile. Unemployment rates, labor productivity, even that labor market tightness is measured.
Ah, tightness. That's the ratio of job openings to unemployed people, right?
Exactly. Vacancies over unemployment. All of those measures jumped around a lot more back then compared to after the war. Unemployment volatility, for instance, more than doubled.
Okay. And you mentioned vacancies and unemployment. There's that relationship. The Beveridge curve. How did that look?
Right. The Beveridge curve normally shows this inverse relationship. Higher unemployment usually means fewer job openings and vice versa.
And it slopes downwards.
Typically, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But in the historical data, especially during the Great Depression, that curve looked flatter.
Flatter, meaning...
Meaning, even with incredibly high unemployment, the number of job vacancies didn't just drop a bit, it dropped way down and stayed low. The usual trade-off wasn't as strong.
So the mechanism was somehow different.
It seems that way. The correlation was weaker, minus 0.79 historically versus minus 0.92 post-war. That suggests the dynamics were, fundamentally different back then.
Okay, so the data paints a pretty grim picture of the Depression. Extremely high, persistent unemployment, low vacancies, lots of volatility. How do economists try to explain this? You mentioned a model.
Yes, the equilibrium search model. It's a framework economists use to understand how job searching, hiring, and wage setting interact.
And this one has a specific feature, something about bargaining.
That's right. It uses what's called credible bargaining for figuring out wages.
Credible bargaining. Okay, I need you to unpack that a bit. How's it different from what's the standard way?
The standard approach is often called Nash bargaining. Credible bargaining is a bit different because it explicitly models the back-and-forth negotiation process, and crucially, it includes the possibility that the negotiations might actually break down. Someone walks away.
Ah, okay. So there's a real risk of no deal. Why is that considered more relevant for the Depression?
Well, the thinking is that during the Depression, various factors might have made wages quite resistant to falling, even with massive unemployment. Things like perhaps the growing influence of unions or maybe government policies trying to prop up wages, this wage rigidity.
Gotcha. So wages didn't just automatically drop because lots of people were looking for work.
Exactly. And the credible bargaining framework, with that risk of breakdown, can potentially capture that kind of rigidity better than some simpler models.
So what are the nuts and bolts of this model? Firms post jobs,
Right. Firms post vacancies, unemployed workers search, they meet through some kind of matching function.
which describes how efficient the job finding process is.
Yeah. And that labor market tightness we talked about plays a role there. Then, if a worker and firm match, they bargain over the wage using this credible bargaining process, offers, counteroffers, risk of breakdown.
And what determines how sticky or flexible wages end up being in this model world?
Two key parameters pop out. Delta, which is the probability the negotiations break down in any given round,
Okay.
and chi, which represents the costs to the parties if they delay reaching an agreement.
Right. So how do delta and chi affect wage stickiness?
If the chance of breakdown, delta, is low, and the cost of delay, chi, is high, well, firms might be less willing to risk blowing up the negotiation by pushing for really low wages. That tends to make wages more insulated from market conditions, more sticky.
Lower delta, higher chi means stickier wages. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so they have this model. How do they actually use it? They can't exactly plug in 1930s conditions directly, can they?
Well, they start by calibrating it. That means they set the model's parameters like delta and chi, and others related to matching and productivity, so that the model's average behavior matches the real world, but specifically the post-war real world.
Ah, okay, so they tune it to match the more normal recent period first, like a baseline.
Exactly. They match things like the average unemployment rate and the volatility of unemployment from, say, 1951 to 2017.
Okay, model set based on post-war data. Then what?
Then they see how well this calibrated model does at explaining the features of the historical data, especially those unemployment crises we talked about, their frequency, their persistence.
And how did it do? Can a model tuned to the stable-ish post-war era say anything useful about the wild pre-war times?
Surprisingly, yeah. The model's predictions for the unconditional probability of a crisis and its persistence were actually pretty close to the estimates from the full historical data series.
That is interesting. So the underlying mechanics captured in the model might be relevant across both periods.
It suggests they might be, yeah. The model also generates that flatter beverage curve during crises, which, again, is consistent with what we saw in the historical data, even if the exact correlation numbers aren't a perfect match.
Okay, but the ultimate test must be the Great Depression itself, right? Can the model replicate that event?
That's the key question. So what they do is they take the calibrated model and then they feed it the actual historical labor productivity data from the 1930s.
So they're saying, okay, model, assume productivity moved like this back then. What would happen to unemployment and output?
Precisely. And what they found was pretty striking. The model, driven by those historical productivity shocks, could account for a very large part of the massive drop in economic output and the extremely high unemployment rates seen during the Depression.
So the productivity drops were key.
They seem to be a major driver in the model. The analysis identified a huge negative productivity shock in 1933, something like 3.4 standard deviations below the norm, based on their filtering method.
3.4 standard deviations. Just remind us, how big is that in normal times?
It's very big, highly unusual. You just don't see shocks of that magnitude, typically. It points to a really severe disruption in the economy's ability to produce things efficiently in 33.
Okay. And how well did the model's output and unemployment predictions line up with the actual 1930s data? Was it a perfect match?
Not perfect. No model ever is. But it captured the main narrative pretty well. The model predicted a big drop in real output per capita, actually slightly more than the data showed in 33, then a recovery, then another dip later in the 30s. That general pattern was there.
In unemployment.
The model generated extremely high unemployment rates in 1933, peaking above 32% for several months in their simulation. That's definitely in the same ballpark as the historical estimates we saw earlier.
Okay, so it got the peak severity reasonably well. Any discrepancies?
One notable difference was the recovery speed. In the model, unemployment came down faster after 1933 than it actually did in reality. So the model captured the crash, but maybe not the full persistence of the high unemployment afterwards.
Okay. Models simplify reality after all. Now, you mentioned filtering. The study talks about detrending the data. Can you explain that quickly and why it matters here?
Sure, economic data usually has a long-term growth trend. To isolate the shorter-term fluctuations, like recessions and booms, the business cycle stuff, researchers detrend the data. They use statistical techniques like the Hodrick-Prescott or HP filter to separate the cycle from the trend.
And how you do that separation, that affects things.
Yes, because the choice of filter, and specifically how much smoothing you apply, determines how much of a long downturn like the Great Depression gets classified as a temporary cyclical dip versus a change in the underlying long-term trend.
Ah, I see. So if you smooth it a lot, the depression might look more like a cyclical thing. But if you smooth less,
Then more of it might be interpreted as a downward shift in the long-run trend itself. This matters because it changes how large that measured productivity shock in 1933 appears.
so did trying different ways of detrending change the main conclusion?
They looked at that. Using a different smoothing parameter for the HP filter, one that treats more of the depression as a trend shift, resulted in a smaller measured productivity shock.
Okay. So then the model wouldn't explain the depression as well.
Not necessarily. They found that even with that smaller measured shock, the model could still generate a major unemployment crisis if they also assumed that wages were more rigid or inertial, essentially, cranking up the wage stickiness implied by the credible bargaining parameters.
Interesting. So it brings us back to wage stickiness again. Did they test that directly, like changing those credible bargaining parameters, delta and chi?
They did. They ran a sensitivity analysis. What happens if you change the probability of bargaining breakdown, delta?
Let me guess. If breakdown is more likely, wages are more flexible.
Exactly. Increasing delta makes the bargaining outcome closer to the standard Nash bargaining case. Wages become more responsive to unemployment. And in the model, that weakened the crisis dynamics. Unemployment didn't spike as high or stay high as long.
Okay. And what about the other parameter, chi? The cost of delaying a deal.
If they decreased chi, meaning it was less costly for firms or workers to just wait, that also made wages more flexible and weakened the crisis dynamics in the model.
So it really seems like getting those credible bargaining parameters right, reflecting more wage inertia, is pretty crucial for the model to replicate something as severe as the Great Depression.
That's a key finding, yes. The analysis showed that if you set delta lower and chi higher, reflecting potentially stickier wages, perhaps due to New Deal policies or other institutional factors of the 1930s, the model could explain the depression's severity even with a smaller measured productivity shock.
It really highlights how important those wage-setting mechanisms are, doesn't it? It's not just about the initial shock, but how the labor market, especially wages, responds.
Absolutely. That wage stickiness seems critical for understanding why the unemployment was so deep and lasted so long. It challenges narratives that might focus only on, say, the initial shock or just a lack of jobs, without considering how wages reacted or didn't react.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground, the historical data, the model, the results. What are the main takeaways for someone listening?
I think the first big thing is that this equilibrium search model, the one with credible bargaining, it actually does a surprisingly decent job. Even when you calibrate it on post-war data, it gives you a good starting point for understanding the kind of extreme unemployment crisis seen in the Great Depression, especially when you feed it the historical productivity numbers.
Right, it captures the frequency, the persistence, the overall severity.
To a reasonable degree, yeah.
Yeah.
And the second key point is really the importance of that credible bargaining aspect and the implied wage inertia or stickiness.
That seems crucial for explaining why crises like the Depression become so severe and protracted. It suggests the institutions and norms around wage setting really matter.
Definitely. It's not just abstract economics. It points to how things like union power, government intervention, or even just expectations about wages can dramatically shape how an economy weathers a storm.
So for you listening, hopefully this deep dive gives you a more, let's say, textured understanding of unemployment crises than just the usual headlines. It shows how economists use these models to grapple with really complex historical events.
And hopefully extract some useful insights about how labor markets function under extreme stress.
So maybe here's a final thought to leave you with. Given what this analysis of the Great Depression suggests, especially about wage stickiness and market mechanisms, how might those insights apply today?
Hmm. Good question. Are there aspects of our current labor markets, our institutions, our wage-setting practices that might make us more or less vulnerable to similar crises in the future?
Exactly. What makes a labor market resilient and what makes it brittle when a shock hits? Definitely something we're thinking about beyond this discussion.
And if you found this interesting, we really do encourage you to look up the original research mentioned or explore more about labor economics and economic history. There's a lot more to learn.